vegan anymore. And I wrote this poem, Many Bird Roast, about the kind of contradictions and complacencies and strangenesses of what it means to not eat animals in a kind of classed context, specifically a working class context. Many Bird Roast. I came in, dandy and present, arguing for a moratorium on meat of the kind splayed out on the table, legs akimbo, like a fallen over ice skater skidding on her backside. There are dogs in the outhouse and all over the world that we do not eat, and one small sparrow in a pigeon, in a grouse, in a swan that we will certainly eat, overlooking all the drama with as many eyes as a spider that will cut in two, and the compacted layers of the various meats will collapse away dreamily as a rainbow melts down into the marsh where it came from, slipping meat from the bone onto a specially designed knife. There's a call out for plates. I'm the only one with a sense of outcry. Someone says, you weren't like this when it was broiling away, smelling like your history, smelling like the deep skin on your knee after playing in the sun all day, skinned with good dirt and your underblood just showing through, smelling like warm, dry furs after burning and the outdoors after fireworks and November's after tea. You eat and smell like the rest of us, dirty rat under your armpit, dirty bird in your stomach. And birds fell down the chimney with thwacks into buckets, and we got so poor we had to eat them too. Strange cockatoos and once a brilliantly lit, pure white dove that we kept in a hutch with a small pot of ink, and when we let it out, it wasn't so much a raven as just a plain black dove, ready to cook, and with superstition I learnt to. I'll read a few poems from my second collection, God Complex, which is... with Kingdomland, I wanted to write one long poem, but I didn't have the guts or the mastery. I still don't have the guts or the mastery, but I tried to pretend that I did for my second collection, God Complex, which follows a narrator as she's moving through a toxic landscape after a very toxic and abusive relationship. I again wanted to create this sense of an off-kilter and kind of broken landscape, and I was very sure that I wanted to make this feel like one sustained narrative, and the conception of this book actually came out of a failed novel and a book of poems that I was sort of writing in tandem, and I did want to create this kind of sense of fictional propulsion through the book. And it takes a lot from histories in literature of hysteria in women, and also this word that I'm learning and seeing everywhere, which is limerence, which is when you're like totally obsessed with someone and they don't love you back. I was like, oh, okay, I've only ever been in limerence. That's where I've lived forever. So I'll read from God Complex for maybe 5 to 7 to 10 minutes, depending on how long it takes. And yeah, if you just think about this one character kind of making her way through this very intoxicated state, I suppose. I look out through stained glass, pressing my neck for religious lumps. In my head, time works on a flattened disc. Here is a wasteland of past aesthetics, patched up with modern tubes like a church. Perhaps I have a deity in me, lucid, angel in the soft reflection. It's a risk, a life with someone. The last time we saw each other as incompatible lovers, I felt a shift occur in my body, the blood switching direction in my veins. It was low burrs of late July, humming day, aging sun, pollen, gore, the light behind you, halo made your head, and it was cliche. What is it to love a person or a virus or a prophylactic acid, a trouble in the systemics, which is like a the municipal architecture of a body, how emotion and clinging make a way through sinus and back out again? Immediately after you left, I swam in the toxic river, rapid and thick with hard scummed edges, feverish from farm waste and floating cut grass, algal blooms in eddying parts from animal matter, made inorganic with antibiotics, a clean, gassy odour, reminding me I'm not far from people or animals kept by people. I swim in the slush and the effluent coats me. Red roots grow like a photograph I saw of a Monsanto pumped lake, plant arms turning pink from the runoff, hemming the water. Nothing else can grow from the glyphosate. Pursued by ciphers, congregational with herself, mad me swam in those green moth-like fumes of evening, sere scenery all around, old chemical smell of gum. I float under the meshed structure of the sky and thank God I am grieving while the climate dims. What an effort otherwise. The houses we rented, rows of pebble-dashed houses, pebble-dashed walls of modernist, overpriced council houses, or the homely view of the boarded-up public toilet block, strip lit, flickering in the coming dusk on the green between towering flats, where men arrive, unannounced, rolling machines over the walls to check for asbestos, fumbling in the old doily drapery, the skirting peeling like an orange, pointing, telling us not to breathe too forcibly in that corner. How to tell a story faithfully and to the cause. Our first house overlooked the bloodbath soil of a racecourse, where the mechanics of a purebred horse leg are oiled, machinic, synchronicity. You can see wealth in horses. There is blood in the lungs of the racehorse after excessive performance. The horse starts to disembark internally when it has leant too hard on itself. Your mother, standing in the doorway, would tell me about the things she did to you, things that may explain his behavior. I enjoyed being used but could not say it, my hand pressed over a red hot grate that I enjoyed it. I make you hear the scapegoat, mimetic violence. The intention of suffering, a lived punishment I felt I deserved. I am returning you to your former meaning in the dim pulpits of the churches in the towns where we lived. One town held the pale, curdled hand of a saint who was pregnant when she'd been pressed to death by weights. I want to switch back my blood. A bird gags sweetly on the new Green Deal as I work my way through ineffable instructions on how to live this poor and shabby life as performance. How do I pack it, sell it? There is masochism in a decade making out under the quilt of an unholy government who never seem to end, who command the dimensions of our poorness while we grow stunted in contaminated soil, eking into the bloodstream, bringing an omnipresent confusion into the social consciousness. How wholly am I to be pressed? A bit between my teeth, you galloped me around like an animal, dallied, pet. Rub me between your fingers like an emulsifying scent, or what you expect to heal you. In being used, I take great power. I tell myself on all fours that yes, I am a god in my submission. It's my fault. I want lovers to find me so attractive, they want to end my life. This is the most flattering and lasting gift bestowed upon the women in my history. They were so loved, it calcified to hate. I have felt it, both the want to kill and to be killed. Being so loved, it turns to threat. Don't tell me otherwise is the truest. This is what I have come to accept. A map of my extended family on the wall. The ataraxic names of the murdered women glow like a pinball game. Land is cruel and inhospitable as a lover, which is why we pursue it, why we punish it. The sun, reflecting on the water, looks good and clean, like a wedding. I don't feel funny, I feel wrecked, like that painting of a ship on a bladder-racked reef, frozen, timely, and always on the verge, radius of cursive, clouds above. Is it being thrown through a window as a grown woman, thrown through a grown window as a changed man, thrown through the grown woman a good window, or growing the limbs of dead relatives through our throats, conjuring a lost voice uncannily, murdered by a love, branch as a tongue, so dig until you meet the dead who'll all look up at you. I scavenge them, part militia, and close the ground when through. How to have sat as a child at a murderer's feet and not been murdered. We come home when our ankles give way, and we come down like how a horse breaks its neck, a bent black pipe angled against grass. I'll finish there. I'm not entirely sure how long I've been reading for, but maybe I will read a new poem. And thank you for having me. That was definitely not 20 minutes, but that's okay. Lots of time for questions. Thank you for being such a wonderful, attentive, amazing audience. I'm probably not in the middle, I'm at the very, very bottom of thinking about my next book, which is very ill-formed in my head. But I'm thinking about creation myths, and I'm thinking about paintings, and I'm also thinking about riddles. And I will read a few poems that feel within the creation moment, and then I'll read a few riddle poems. I've become very obsessed with the Exeter book. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the Exeter book. It's a book of medieval riddles written by monks anonymously, and some of them were very bawdy and sexy, but they were also kind of about like cups and swallows and gnats, and they are just like a really significant document of Anglo-Saxon poetry. It's like one of the 5 bits of Anglo-Saxon poetry that we have. And they're very funny, and they're very communal. And I feel like I would like my next book to have this kind of anonymous communal feeling. So I'll read a few of these, and then when the riddles come, I'll tell you I'm reading a riddle poem, and I would like you to try and guess what the poem is about. But I'll never tell you because the monks never told people either. The Exeter book is amazing for anyone who wants to play a 1,000-year-old guessing game with dead monks, which I love to do. Okay, these are some creation poems. As the sopping fruit pip, sponge of life, crawled to dry earth, so it began, so we thought. The catastrophic outside comes down to this. Black snakes and white butterflies in undergrowth, agglutinate and together, underfoot and in darkness. Nothing goes away, nothing arrives. Between the ears, in the crumpled park, through the grassy maze, the lines that are made and forged through neglect are a zigzag of territories you can map to the mind. There is one open-mouthed and sagging magnolia clinging to the wall, fringed and filthy with age at her edges. How will I ever fit my whole life into this short life? Small but tall lighthouse of perspective malfunction, gold at the edges, look closer, smudged fly on the glass, like the pads of her feet in an insectile unction. Okay, I will read one riddle poem and then one final new poem, which is kind of mythy. Riddle. I create the kind of madness committed to the young man whose name was Sweet Gummo, who lived in a stone dwelling on a dark moor with a wife and 7 daughters for the whole length of his unnaturally long life. And he did live 80 years and 10 with this wife, who, now that I think about it, must have disliked living inside a stone within a cave. Was she climbing the walls as I would be climbing the walls? Did she proffer her many babies up to the gods in the dead of night and ask for them to be taken while they slept? God help me, she might have said. I didn't know I would have so many. Just take 1 or 2. I cannot be measured to within an inch of my life, and my shape is not as hers, and sometimes I fill you with disdain, and at other times I drive you home. Let me in. I'm at the door. I won't let up like a man who stalks. I'm never done. Something about these riddles as well. They speak from the thing that the riddle is about. I'll actually only read one, and I'll read this final poem, and then I will cease. 2 women. I remember the story of 2 women who lived on a moor. They were mother and daughter, or they were sister and sister, or they were lovers, or they lived on an island just near to where I grew up, or they lived in a small stone house at the bottom of a lane, and they held get-togethers with the local people who were tenants, or family, or lovers. And their parties would get so raucous that they'd go on into the night, and their guests wore drag, and they would wander down into the dunes, drunk, to get close to the sea's edge, and sometimes the guests would fall in and be swept away. All these women were never seen by the villagers they lived within and between, and they were the source of much discussion and disparaging, or they were often called upon for their knowledge of herbs and foraging, or they were punished for their knowledge of herbs and foraging. Either way, the story is one that makes me jealous, as I think of how they'd hold hands or hook their arm in arm and stride down the lane, and how they'd talk in a language I certainly couldn't understand, it being the language of my country, which is no longer spoken, or they speak in such a dialect that only other villagers could have known what they said. I found out later, for a period, they lived in the home that I lived in when I was young, a house so small I could only squeeze my arm through the door. They had divided the space in such a way as to create a warm but informal divide, close enough to touch, separate enough to leave each other alone. And a while later, I heard that when one of the women died, the remaining woman shriveled up like a diseased tree, a broken little ash, like the dead woman began living in the living woman, or they were just so close, so in love. There was between them the umbilical cord of connections, and within months, the living sister joined her dead sister, because if you're bound to something dead like that, its toxicity will just flow right back into you. On a very grey day, when the sun was low and overpowering and the wind bit, I went to their funeral, or I didn't. It was small and it was big. There were many mourners, but there were just a few. The food was good, but it was bad. There was no food, unfortunately, because there was no funeral, and of course, there are no women. Thank you.
Just move this stuff around. Is that... yeah. All right. So.
Thank you for listening, everyone.
Maybe we should just
should.
Sorry. That was amazing. Thank you. Oh, there's one over here.
Okay, cool.
Test. All right. That was amazing. Thank you, Rachel. I just wanted to stay a bit longer in the world of your poems. Thank you for reading the newer work as well. So just to preface kind of the idea as well of the session. So some of the most amazing poetry editors working in the UK now, poets themselves. And I feel like that's something that we don't often talk about, like how your own aesthetic, how your own interests become kind of engaged and challenged as a poetry editor when you're surrounded by so much work. You're reading so many submissions, and what you look for in the work. Earlier today, you mentioned that you didn't set out to be an editor. You weren't interested in being an editor. You just had poets that you really wanted to publish. Could you tell us about some of your first poets that you published at Granta, and how that kind of shaped how you work now as a poetry editor?
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure lots of poets here, lots of poets who are being published or thinking about publishing. And for a decade, I worked at Granta as the poetry editor, and what that involved was reading huge amounts of submissions every year. And I was lucky enough to be able to make that space in a literary magazine that has been predominantly focused on fiction and non-fiction, and sort of muscle in a few poets, which then became a more regular feature. We would try to publish at least 4 or 5 poets, I think, in the print edition, and lots more poets online. And it was through that magazine that I mainly found a number of the poets that I went on to work with in a more sort of consistent and long-term way. And through the submittable portal, basically, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, where you submit your poems to the magazine. We used to get something like 13,000 submissions a year, which was amazing, and I used to love reading the submissions. But yeah, I mean, a few specific writers that I sort of, I came across in the submittable and then went on to publish or even write about in an academic context. Somebody like Sylvia Legree, a fantastic Canadian poet, published by New Directions, and I published her at Granta, and I'm now publishing her at Fitzcarraldo. The incredible writer Mary Ruefle, who I think probably inspires me now more than she used to. In particular, that last piece that I read, I'm trying to move into a more kind of fictitious feeling space, and Mary Ruefle writes these wonderful absurdist short pieces. Holly Pester, who wrote this incredible long poem, Comic Timing, about temporality and abortion and feminism. And I noticed that all of these poets hadn't been published in the UK, perhaps in the way that I felt that maybe they deserved to be, which was by a larger... some of them had been published incredibly in the UK, like Holly Pester had wonderful publications before we did Comic Timing. But I think I was keen to sort of present them in a sort of considered book fashion, and maybe create a bit more of an audience for them through the kind of Granta channels, you know, because Granta has that kind of readership. So yeah, I sort of found them through the submittable, or a number of them through the submittable, and ended up working with them for a really long time. Some of them for over 10 years now, which is really special.
Yeah, you brought the advanced review copy of the new Holly Pester. It's really, if you haven't read Comic Timing, it's an amazing book. Highly recommend. I'm really interested in this process of going from being a poetry editor at Granta magazine, 13,000 submissions. I mean, if you break that down to like how many you can squeeze in a day, in a morning, in an afternoon, and you said you enjoyed it. I know sometimes editors talk about the slush pile in a less than fond way. I'm really interested in what was it about these works that made them stand out to you, and that made you... Do you remember a particular moment when you're reading these works in the submittable format for the first time, and you're like, yes, I have to... there is a readership for this, or there needs to be, and it needs to be. We need a book.
Yeah, I think I remember that with another poet, Sasha Debevec-McKenney, who I worked with for about 5 years, from seeing her poems for the first time in the submittable to her book publishing, which is a book called Joy Is My Middle Name, which is currently on the shortlist with Dylan Thomas Prize, and it is absolutely amazing and brilliant. And I remember reading her poems and just thinking, like, I have to have this person in my life, and I just want to do what I can to shout her poetics from the rooftop. I think one of the big things about having that space at Granta, or trying to make that space, was that I was just very, very keen to get people read, but not in a... I just wanted to share my love for the work. I was saying earlier that I'm just like a fanatic and an enthusiast at my core, and when I read a poem I love, I just want to make sure everyone reads it, or as many people as possible. And I was also saying that one of the things that makes me know if I want to publish somebody is if I'm jealous of their work. That's basically my only kind of remit. If I read their poems or their book and I wish I'd written it, then I like to be able to publish it. And also I think I don't feel very led or kind of dictated by a particular style. I might not be able to see that because I'm publishing, and I'm sure somebody else could say, well, this is the style of work that you publish. But I do feel like I enjoy a broad church of poetry, and I love work that's very narrative. I love work that's very sound-led. I love work that's very image-led. I like book-length poems. I like books that have individual poems. I really do feel very open and expansive, hopefully, in the work that I want to read and publish. And yeah, the jealousy thing is my only marker, really.
I love that you say that. Like, this work made me jealous, so I knew I needed this person in my life, and I needed to champion these poems and find their readers.
I like to ride other people's coattails. I think that's the feel. My editorial experience is like, I am going to attach myself to you, brilliant person.
You said a broad church, and that's something that other editors have talked about in terms of kind of what makes your contribution so amazing. I mean, so earlier this semester we brought in Sarah Howe. Some of you, I think, were at the reading for that. And then also Luke Thompson. And every time I ask, like, so who do you feel have been the most influential poetry editors in the UK? Everyone says your name first. I guess I'm wondering, what makes you so awesome? Or why do you think that is? Why do you feel like do you feel like a lot of it is the position you were able to access in Granta and that kind of, that perch to be able to kind of introduce people to Will Harris and Holly Pester and things like that? Or what do you think it is?
I think I wouldn't. That's very kind of all those people. I would say that I think that the poetry editor pool is so lovely because it's everyone's quite good. I don't say it's not good friends like all just hanging out and buddying up, but there's a lot of collegiality, I think, with poetry editors now. If I'm not able to publish something at Fitzcarraldo, I will email John at Carcanet and say, this is an incredible thing that I think suits Carcanet really well. I will often get submissions from other editors coming in. And I think that it's really wonderful to just be buoyed by a similar kind of group of fanatics who really are just publishing because they love it. Also because they're being paid, but like they're led by love, I think. And I have always felt very compelled to try and just make space for the work. Or that makes it sound really do-goody. I feel like I'm just quite like, I will make space. I'm just quite stubborn and don't really, I'm not very good at taking no for an answer in lots of different fields. When I was younger, I started with a number of students at Goldsmiths, a small press called Clinic, and it was just a really nice kind of piece of like early collaborative work that showed me that you can do it yourself. You can just make books and publish people that you like and who are next to you and create a community, which I think is actually something that I'm most interested in, even if I don't necessarily articulate that or identify it in the front. Like, I love the idea of writing communities, and I love the idea of sharing work with other people, and I love the idea that this is kind of educational and communal and, yeah, just expansive and imaginative, I think. Yeah.
So you're not waiting for permission? You're just like, this needs to happen, and no one can tell me no.
Yeah.
That's about
Maybe. But I think it's also, I do think, as we were talking about earlier, when you're a poetry editor, it often comes down to sort of one person having that fanaticism or enthusiasm or like real love, who will then maybe bring in work or make that space for work. And I am like, you know, historically in the 20th century, there are such incredible editors in poetry that have made that space, sustained that space, and propped that space up with time and labor and sort of publishing. And, you know, I think about, I still hear and think always about Tom Shivers and Penned in the Margins and the kind of like ripple effect that a press like that has, a really risky, amazing, independent small press. And he did that with, you know, a number of kind of assistants and helpers and things, but he just like really led the charge with publishing some extraordinary work. And I think, you know, all editors are just sort of following in the footsteps of the people that came before them, aren't they? And hopefully retaining the space for the editors that will come next.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then hopefully you all have questions as well. I don't want to hug Rachel. What's your favorite part of the process of from soliciting work, commissioning work, finding work, maybe even just like reading somebody in a journal and thinking this person now is on my radar, and imagining a book in the distance, all that, from that to having a manuscript, to editing the manuscript, to seeing the book in print, finding readers for it, doing events. What is your favorite part of that process?
I can say my least favorite part.
Yeah, we can start there.
At the end of it.
Yeah.
I don't really like organizing events very much. That really stresses me out because I never have a birthday party or anything like that. I find that the public facing stuff I sort of have to retreat from a little bit, which maybe makes more sense when I think that my favorite part is actually when I'm editing the book, when I'm sitting alone with the book and I'm in conversation with the poet. I think that moment of like deep editorial collaboration and intention is really sacred to me. And there's always this moment when me and the author have to give the book over to the copy editor or it goes to press. And I just think we're saying goodbye to this pocket of privacy that we've created and established in this incredible work. And now we're about to give it over to the world, which is so wonderful and so precious. And I love that feeling so much of just like putting a book into history and into circulation, especially, you know, the books I want to publish, which are stylish and gorgeous and funny and moving, but they're also politically necessary in many different ways. But that moment of sort of sacred connection with someone where you're just really, really powerfully caring about where a comma's going to go or what word choice is most appropriate, that's my favorite bit.
That's such a special space because no one else really gets to see that or even hear about it. And I think it's meaningful for the author too, because they get to see the fact that you've paid attention, you've noticed that something that was in the beginning of the book reappears later on, and you can follow the thread of kind of themes or characters or what a voice that kind of emerges, image. And I think, you know, to have a real close reader and an editor, that's a special friendship.
And you'll know this, it like keeps you up at night. Like I'll wake up in the morning and be like, no, it must be this way. And I'm quite I'm not a hard editor, but I definitely like edit a lot. And I get very obsessed with the way things should be. You know, I have very clear visions and those visions always align with my authors. But I just love that kind of, I love that kind of care. I love the history of editing as well and how, you know, significant poems or books have changed off of the back of editorial intervention. That kind of sacred secret space when it starts to be peeled back is so embarrassing, which I also kind of love. It's like very humiliating to see drafts and drafts and the kind of conversation that you've had over these drafts. It's like horrible love letters or something.
Fantastic. Any questions? Yeah.
How do you find navigating at that point when you're working on a manuscript, the difference between refining someone's work and actually imposing your own style on it?
Yeah, that's a really cool question. I think when I worked at Granta, I worked for an amazing editor, and really early on, one of her like tenets at the magazine was you don't change an author's voice, you work with their voice to make it stronger. And I think I've never been an editor that I never say something's bad, and I teach as well, and often I find that my students are very quick to castigate themselves. They're very quick to say like, oh, this is a bad bit. And I think, no, we've got to focus on what feels strong in the poem. Why is that strong? Where has it come from? Which bit of research or thinking or dream has conjured this like wonderful line. How do we expand on this line? How do we think through what is already strong here? With authors that I've known for a very long time and I've worked with for a very long time, I can kind of see when they're maybe falling into patterns that, they might want to break out of a little bit. So that's quite nice to say, I feel like maybe you've trod this ground before. Could you go in this direction? I think of being an editor as something more like just an extra pair of eyes. And I love being edited because it just reveals things to you that you would otherwise not be able to see because we're so limited by our own perspective. So I feel there are moments where I'm like, do it this way. And they say no. And I'm like, yeah, I was being too heavy-handed there. So you're always kind of learning, I think, and you're always kind of towing that line. But yeah, I think leading with like what is strong and not being critical is a good thing. Or that's how I like to work, or try to work.
Any other questions?
Yeah. I think not. I do think there's an instinctual. I think there's a shape that a poem's going to fall into instinctually, and there's a poet, and I can't remember who it was now, who used to he published that very famous poem about mushrooms in a shed. Anyone remember this? Yeah. Yes. I think it was Derek Mahon who would edit his poems after he'd published them, because there are loads of different versions of that Mushrooms in the Shed poem. But he would change really minor things. And that always comes back to me when I think about this conversation, because the poem will be what it needs to be, right, broadly. And you can tinker back and forward, back and forward. I think that when you get to a point of like real tinkering, it's kind of not that consequential, because the poem has found its place and body and shape. And I think there's a moment where you have to stop and get somebody else involved and just say, what does this look like? I also think with a poem, when I think about a poem, there are spots that just feel more vulnerable. Like we know instinctually when we've got like a really good line or a really good stanza or a really good paragraph. And there are moments that just don't feel as like sturdy. I have it very much with this book, actually. I feel like, and I kind of wanted there to be vulnerabilities in this book that felt slightly, I don't want to say weaker, but like they could have come out, or they could have been changed or edited. And I think we can just kind of tell, like our gut tells us, or like the cosmos tells us that a poem is kind of done or something is finished. But then it isn't actually really finished. It just continues to reiterate, and we will always work with the same kind of preoccupations. And one of the pieces of advice I always give to my authors is like just to slow down, because you will only get the opportunity to publish that book once, and you want to make sure that that idea is fully extinguished and fully finished before you rush it into the world. So yeah, I guess the cosmos will tell you. I'm sure it was Derek Mahon who did all those changes. Thank you, that was a good poetry jukebox moment, because I can never remember the names of poets.
I was wondering if there's been any moments where you've really struggled with an editing process, or even where an editing process just hasn't worked out, and if you could give any reflections on that. You don't have to name names.
Not with books, actually, to be honest. I think with books, there's never been anything like that significant because it's so collaborative and it's so positive. And I think I'm literally racking my brains right now, but there is just no moment where I've fallen out with an author or something. When I was on the magazine, because I was working with so many different poets, and I remember early on, because I joined Granta when I was quite young. I joined Granta when I was like 24, and I like to edit, so I'd just go in on a poem and I'd be like messing it up and moving it around. And sometimes people would be like, "Oh, you are gonna edit me? Like, what are you doing?" And sometimes there'd be some like real feisty men, mainly, who would say, "Don't edit me, child." But they were few and far between.
I almost want to know the names because
To be honest, I couldn't even remember. I think it was more just sometimes people would be like, "Oh, I didn't realize that poetry editors actually edited." Yeah. But it was very. I've never really had anything like, go down that extraordinarily. There is one, but I will not talk about it on this. It's live streamed.
Oh,
I'll tell you after. Very, very minor poetry tea.
it's poets aren't the most stable people often.
Who is right
So.
now? Bloody hell.
But no, it's helpful to have cautionary tales, especially if you want to go into publishing. Yeah.
I guess you read a lot, such as Joe, when you read manuscripts, but what were your reading habits? What do they look like? Kind of on a daily basis, do you have like a routine, or
That is such a nice question. I'd love to ask everyone what their reading habits are. I read, I'll read anything pretty much. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I read a lot of fiction. I read a lot of fiction. I've been trying to write a novel, so I've just been like inhaling ways in which to write a novel and thinking about novel shapes and forms. I read, obviously, so much poetry. It was really nice actually being here today and just having a moment to like move through the shelves, which I used to do at the Poetry Library on the South Bank in London, and just sort of see poets like Roddy Lumsden, who I worked with when I was a younger poet, and such an extraordinary writer. To have all this book series like incredibly special. And I think I read a lot of poetry for work, and I would like to maybe think about reading again poetry that's not as contemporary as the work that I tend to read all the time, which is like very, very contemporary. Maybe go back into the 20th century and before to just replenish my kind of pot so I can recall Derek Mahon, etc. But yeah, I read a lot.
is there any like, again, it's a hard question, let's say like in the last year, it's like three really underrated
Poets.
things that you should be reading?
Underrated poets. Underrated poets. Well, I feel bad. The authors that I work with, I feel very, very strongly about. I mean, Jeremy Prynne, the incredible poet. I don't know if people read J.H. Prynne. He passed away yesterday. Huge, influential, massively significant, towering figure of 20th and 21st century poet, who was just so influential for so many poets, basically. And we should all be reading him, I think. Okay, May Bersenbrugger, who is my favorite poet of all time and is kind of a god to me. And she is not underrated. She's definitely very critically acclaimed and considered, but she's not published here and has written many, many collections, my favorite of which is Hello, the Roses. She's published by New Directions in America. Extraordinary, philosophical, experimental, spiritual, ecological. She's amazing. She's my favorite poet. And then I would also probably say Will Alexander, who I always talk about, who is an American poet who just is like, writes sci-fi poetry, basically, and is so expansive and so interested in language and so broad and so curious and so wild and amazing. And he writes so much, and it's like thrilling and sinister and animalistic, and you can't really even articulate his work. So yeah, let's read Prynne and May Bersenbrugger and Will Alexander. They'd be my three. But they're like my three favourite poets, pretty much. So they're not underrated. But I guess they're not as well read as I'd like them to be, maybe. Maybe they are now. I don't know. It's hard for me to say. Cool. They'll all be here. Yeah.
Since you read like so many different kinds of poetry, is there like a way that you can articulate like the quality that makes it really great, and that makes you famous, like kind of that applies to what you read for RC?
No, you did. If anything, it's like my get out when people ask me, like, what is it that makes you want to publish something? I'm always like, I'll say now jealousy, but you've wheedled your way in, and you're like, but what is it? So thank you. And to be honest with you, I just don't know. I think like if I do try to pass it or think about it or talk about it, it's like authenticity and truth to a voice. Like I think you can tell when a poet is being true to their interests and their preoccupations, and they're kind of letting the like muse take over a little bit, but they're also very well read and it's crafted and masterful, but it feels new or something. Like when I first read two poets who I work with, Sylvia Legree is hugely kind of syntactically and lexically expansive. She uses lots of like dictionaries and old texts to mine words. So her books and her poems just feel like real dense kind of like language games, and they're very sonorous, and they look gorgeous on the page. And I was like, I've never read anything like this before. And then with Sasha Debevec-McKenney, the other writer that I work with, she's just so funny. Like, and I was saying earlier that I love poems that are funny, and they are rare. And I was reading her poems and I like laugh and I feel so moved. And she loves stand-up, and they do kind of have punchlines. And there was just something in that like innovation. Both poets innovate in entirely different ways that made me feel very like just completely won over by what they were doing. They had a poetics, I think, like they had a practice that you can see, and it was, just very brilliant.
You were talking earlier about one of the challenges of your new role at Fitzcarraldo is reading translations, and how this was a new thing for you. I wanted to ask, do you read poetry translations differently than poetry submissions which were written in English? And do you bring different questions, or do you find yourself thinking of context differently? Or is it just the quality of the work on the page that speaks to you or not?
I think so at Fitzcarraldo, obviously Fitzcarraldo Editions is known for publishing a lot of work in translation, and a large part of the fiction and non-fiction list is work in translation. And when I joined, Jacques, the amazing publisher, said that we want to make space for poetry in translation alongside what I was previously publishing most of, which was like young British and American poets. And we set up the Poetry in Translation Prize, which some of you may have seen, which is basically a prize with which we teamed up with New Directions in America and Giramondo in Australia to find a wonderful book of poems that we might not have had access to, that was being translated into English, basically. And we had submissions from all over the world, and an incredible short list of really brilliant poems from like some like sort of smaller languages. I don't know what the correct terminology is, like languages that are maybe not as present or prevalent in literature. And I think that maybe made me think a little bit, or just gave me an extra bit of awareness when I'm reading poetry in translation, because I think previously I would just read poetry in translation. I wouldn't even necessarily actually think about the act of translation. I would just read the poems on the page as they were in English. And I think over the last few years, if you are an editor, if you are a reader, if you are a writer, the debates and the kind of conversations around translation are so involving and so political and so present that you kind of just have to listen and think about how you're publishing this work and what you're publishing it into and where you're publishing from. I am, I don't have another language. I only speak English and like bad holiday French and Italian. And it's a really good lesson in, I think one thing that Fitzcarraldo does is elevate translators and thinks very seriously about the position that translators have in the publishing process. And a lot of the work that comes through now, to me, is via translators. And I think that that's something that I've learned, that I've made myself learn a little bit more about, I suppose. But as someone who wasn't necessarily that privy to work in translation, it's been a really good learning curve for me to just activate that self a little bit more, or activate that bit of myself a bit more, and look for more translated stuff too.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, so like thinking about the author's preoccupations, I suppose. That kind of, yeah. I think, yeah, thank you. It's very blurry for me now, being an editor. I don't know how you feel as a translator and a poet, but it does become very blurry. I think that we all have our preoccupations and we all have the things that we will return to and write about over and over again. And that's informed from like context, history, lineages, class, race, gender, etc. And I know that I have been very, very preoccupied and very interested in working classness and violence against women within those contexts, and ecologies, the politics of ecologies and animals. And I know that in my first two books, I was working through a lot of what I wanted to say indirectly or directly about those things. And I think our preoccupations are lifelong, and it's just the various ways that we kind of like newly research that and keep abreast of like conversations and scholarship that is happening in those areas, which is like ever changing. And I see it in my authors, I see like an author I work with, Will Harris, who's extraordinary. He was the first poet that I published at Granta. He is my collaborative soulmate, actually, in making books. He's so interested in speech and how we receive speech and how we speak, who's speaking to who and how, and this idea of the kind of the world that speech creates outside of its speakers. And I see that run through the work that I have helped him with, or like been the editor on. And it's so amazing just to see how that kind of preoccupation can shift and find character, through poetry, non-fiction, fiction. It's amazing. I do think that there are some things that I'll never, ever, ever write about, like the digital and AI, because I don't know how to use a computer, basically. So that will never be my preoccupation. But yeah, is that kind of the answer? Is that right? Yeah. I don't know if people feel the same, that they return to the same kind of areas of interest, picking the scab of our knowledges. Oh my God, maybe. Do you like it? We did a podcast with Faber, me and my pal Jack Underwood, and I'm glad you like it, because sometimes I think about how much I would just chat absolute shit on that podcast, and I'm like, fucking hell, I can never listen to any of them. I would think we would like to. I don't really know. It's up to Faber, I think. It's quite a lot of work, actually, because you have to get the poets in the room. and you have to do all this prep, and then, yeah, it was amazing though. We loved it, and doing a podcast as someone who likes to chat shit is really, really fun for me. I hope so. There's so many good poetry podcasts as well. I was happy to contribute to that landscape. Do you have a podcast? Yeah. If we don't, you should. But you should anyway. Even if we don't, you should.
I think we have time for maybe one more. Yes.
I think that's a really wonderful question. And I think it also forms the basis of a lot of these conversations around translation, which is the role of the translator, I suppose, like the ways in which the translator is interpreting the text. Again, I'm saying this, I'm not a translator. I'm kind of just like funneling through the conversations that I've heard. You'll be able to attest to this more. But I think as an editor, when we're thinking about how to translate untranslatable bits of language, image, metaphor, you just trust what the translator is doing and their relationship with the author, because it will always be the translator, probably, who has the awareness of that cultural difference as much as they can. I suppose with translation, it will always be a kind of, I mean, translation is metaphor, isn't it, in a way, because you're sort of moving something through into a new space of knowing. And I think, yeah, as an editor, my instinct is just to trust the translator and the translator's relationship with their author. I will pass over to the actual translator in the room, though.
No, that's really helpful, because I'm thinking back at our proof stages for Goat Song, and very often, if you had a query, it was very tactfully like, is this? What is this? Like it was a question. It wasn't so much as like, this needs to be changed, right? Because you mentioned some of the heavy-handed things in the past that might have come up in conversations with your poets. But no, you seem to approach the process with a lot of curiosity. In terms of how to translate, I mean, metaphors certainly, but idioms are often the most tricky, because word for word, very often if you translate a word for word, it makes no sense. That's part of the beauty of idioms, and that's why they're so dominant in our language, is because they add character, they add color to our language, but they don't often make literal sense. And my personal guideline, like if I'm translating something and I'm trying to find an equivalent, is, okay, so one, I don't translate from the French, but one that comes to mind is, when chickens have teeth, would be the word-for-word translation. And I guess here in the UK, you actually have that phrase a little bit, chicken's teeth. I heard somebody say it the other day. Not so common in the US. And so if you're trying to figure out how to translate this idiom, it's like, okay, I want to find something that makes literal sense, so it means the same thing. I also want something that kind of matches the rhetoric, if possible, matches like when blank blank. And then if it has an animal, then even better. So for that, it would be like when pigs fly. Like there's no way, there's no chance. It's very rare, very unlikely that this is going to happen. So what changes there is the animal changes, but the meaning is the same. So I think you have to think about, as a translator, how readily accessible is this metaphor, this idiom, to the reader in that language? And is it strange to a reader in that language? If so, I feel my job is to make it strange in the English, to preserve that element. Is it more about the sound? Is it more because it references a particular animal, which is then punning something that a character said or something? There's so many, you just have to find out how important it is, and then take it case by case, I find. But it's so fun, and I think one of the most kind of like, if you haven't done any translation at all, giving it a shot, even if you're working with someone who's a language specialist, it's so fun because you just end up doing so much wordplay and going deep into why do we actually use this particular idiom? Why do we use this word? And finding the kind of music and oftentimes things like alliteration that are very common kind of in our language use. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox. But that's just to answer that question. It's a lovely kind of lifelong experience of playing with language. Because as Anne Carson says, languages aren't, one language, a word in one language does not equal a word in another language, ever, almost. It's very rare. There's different cultural information and residue attached to it. There's different intensity, different hues, different colors, different kind of registers. And the translator has to know that to make sure. But we can talk about it more later as well, if you want. Thank you for the question. Well, I guess thank you very much for coming. Thank you so much, Rachel, once again.
Thank you, everybody.
It's a pleasure. And if you have any questions that you weren't able to ask, the conversation can continue. We're in the building for at least another hour, so do feel free to linger. Thank you.